Imagine being locked in a room, forced to team up with your absolute worst enemy. Why? Because there's a much bigger, far more terrifying monster trying to break down the door. You completely hate each other's guts, your values are total opposites, but right now, your survival depends entirely on working together. It's a desperate, high-stakes gamble. But here's the ultimate question. What happens the exact second that monster at the door is finally defeated? You're still in that room. You're still with your enemy. And now, you are the only two left standing. It's basically the ultimate buddy cop scenario gone totally wrong, and it perfectly sets the stage for one of the most tense standoffs in modern history, the Cold War.
But before continuing, we upload new history videos every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the bizarre historical reality that literally divided the globe. We're talking, of course, about the United States and the Soviet Union. Two massive, incredibly powerful superpowers. Going into the middle of the 20th century, they were locked in a super dangerous, entirely incompatible dynamic. You know, we often think of history as this clean, simple timeline, but the truth? It's usually a whole lot messier. To understand how the world froze into a decades-long standoff, we really have to unpack the deeply flawed relationship between these two giants.
Part 1. Teaming up with your enemy. So during World War II, the US and the Soviet Union actually fought on the exact same side. But let's be clear, they were strictly reluctant partners. This absolutely wasn't some friendship forged in mutual respect. Not at all. It was a temporary alliance born out of sheer, undeniable necessity. They didn't trust each other. They didn't even like each other. They were just two people trapped in a burning building who suddenly realized they needed both of their weights to bust open the exit door.
Which brings us to part 2, the great ideological collision.
To really understand this clash, you have to look at the communist doctrine of the Soviets. Picture a giant machine where every single gear, belt, and lever is controlled from one central command room. The state owns the factory, the state directs the labor, and private enterprise, the idea of you just opening up your own competing factory down the street, is completely off the table. It's a system designed entirely around absolute collective structure. Then, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you've got the United States. The core American ideal was built on capitalism, free enterprise, and this whole concept of rugged individualism. If the Soviet system was a massive, state-run machine, the US system was a chaotic, bustling marketplace. The whole idea is that you forge your own path, you own your own business, and you succeed or fail based entirely on your own individual hustle.
Communist doctrine versus capitalism and free enterprise. Guys, they aren't just different, they are completely mutually exclusive. They literally cannot exist in the same space. It's like trying to mix oil and water, or better yet, driving two massive freight trains toward each other on the exact same track. A collision wasn't just possible here, it was absolutely guaranteed.
Part 3. The Nazi Germany catalyst.
So if a collision was guaranteed, why didn't it happen sooner? Well, because a massive existential roadblock suddenly appeared on those tracks. As is so often the case in history, despite their massive foundational differences, America and Soviet Russia found themselves facing a common enemy, Nazi Germany. This terrifying threat acted as the ultimate catalyst, forcing a hard pause on their impending ideological crash. They literally had to stop looking at each other and start looking at the immediate threat right in front of them.
It created this incredibly dangerous three-step cycle. Step 1, you start as deep ideological rivals. Step 2, a larger threat emerges, instantly turning you into reluctant partners against a common enemy. But step 3 is the trap. The tension is actively building the whole time, because the second that shared threat disappears, you inevitably revert right back to step 3, enemies once again.
Part 4. Sowing the Cold War seeds.
Fast forward, and the biggest war the world has ever seen finally draws to a close. The common enemy is defeated. Nazi Germany falls. That terrifying monster at the door, it's finally gone. But think back to our opening question. What happens when the monster is gone and you're still stuck in the room with your worst enemy? Instantly, the glue holding the United States and the Soviet Union together just vanished. It evaporated literally overnight. There was no shared goal anymore. There was absolutely no mutual survival instinct keeping them on the same side of the table. That temporary pause button on their ideological collision had just been unpressed.
And that is exactly how the seeds of the Cold War were sown. The end of World War II didn't bring true global peace at all. It merely cleared the stage for a brand new, colder conflict. The rugged individualism of the West and the communist doctrine of the East were now the only two massive forces left standing on the global stage, staring directly at each other.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering reality. The world was now split right down the middle between two unstoppable forces that fundamentally believed the other shouldn't even exist. The shared monster was gone, but the real standoff was only just beginning. What happens when two entirely incompatible superpowers are left completely alone in a room with no common enemy, and their fingers resting right on the trigger? That's the terrifying reality of the post-war world. A standoff that would completely dictate global politics for the next half-century and literally shape the world we live in today. Thanks for diving into this explainer with me. Keep questioning history, and I'll catch you in the next one.
How do two absolute heavyweights fight a bitter global war for 45 years without ever firing a single direct shot at one another? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the ultimate standoff, the Cold War. We're going to see exactly how humanity danced right on the absolute edge of extinction for half a century.
I mean, it's a totally counterintuitive concept, right? We call it a Cold War simply because the United States and the Soviet Union never actually engaged in direct, hot combat. But let me tell you, the stakes, they were anything but cold. To really wrap your head around those stakes, you just need to look at one number: 60,000. That was the staggering peak number of nuclear weapons stockpiled during this era. Just think about that. A single miscalculation wouldn't just mean losing a battle. It literally meant the fiery, total end of human civilization as we know it. Okay, let's set the scene. It's 1945. The dust is just starting to settle on a completely ruined Europe, leaving this massive power vacuum. And stepping into it are two totally unrivaled superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. You know, their brief alliance to defeat a common enemy, yeah, that shattered almost instantly. Suddenly, you have these two absolute giants staring each other down, both completely convinced that their specific way of life was the absolute only way forward for humanity. So let's get right into part one, the ideological divide. To really grasp why these nations were willing to risk the end of the world, we gotta look past land or natural resources. This was a fundamental, structural deadlock. On one side, you have the West championing capitalism. We're talking free markets, private property, and individual liberty. Then, on the flip side, the East champions communism, state ownership, central planning, and prioritizing the collective over the individual. They are just absolute structural opposites. And this tension, it definitely didn't just appear overnight. The momentum actually traces all the way back to 1848 with Karl Marx, eventually erupting into the massive, bloody rise of the Soviet Union in the 1920s. By the time 1945 rolls around, the Soviets are a full-blown military juggernaut. And by 1946, those ideological seeds from the 19th century, well, they've weaponized into a brand new world order. The lines were officially drawn. Which brings us to part two, drawing the Iron Curtain.
With the battle lines drawn in the minds of the leaders, it was time to actually draw them on the map. So what was the West's opening move in this giant global chess match, the Truman Doctrine? I want you to think of this as the ultimate blocking maneuver. It was a formal pledge by the U.S. to contain Soviet communist expansion literally anywhere in the world. The strategy wasn't to attack directly, no, but to build this unbreachable wall of containment.
And wow, did this trigger some rapid cause and effect momentum. First, the U.S. launches the Marshall Plan, pumping billions into rebuilding Western Europe, basically buying loyalty and fortifying those nations against communist influence. In response, the Soviets push right back with the 1948 Berlin blockade, cutting off supply lines just to test the West's limits. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the newly born CIA and KGB are diving headfirst into these intense shadow wars of espionage and covert ops. Boom. The Iron Curtain is locked firmly in place. But here's the crazy part. This intense geopolitical tension didn't just stay overseas. It completely infected the domestic front too. In the US, fear fueled massive suspicion. We're talking about the era of McCarthyism, where government officials, Hollywood actors, and even everyday citizens had their lives completely ruined over alleged communist ties. The standoff was so incredibly intense that people started desperately hunting for the enemy within. It really proves that the psychological toll of the Cold War was every bit as heavy as the political one. Moving on to part three, the global chessboard. So, Europe is effectively gridlocked, right? A single aggressive move there literally meant World War III. So instead, the conflict bursts across the rest of the globe. And this right here is exactly how superpowers fight without firing directly at each other. They essentially use the third world as their battlefield. From backing opposing factions in the Korean War, to the Suez Crisis, to the brutal, drawn-out tragedy in Vietnam, and the massive rise of Mao's communist China, millions of people died in these proxy conflicts, all while the superpower puppet masters sat safely back in Washington and Moscow. And the competition wasn't just military either. It became a race for ultimate human supremacy. On one hand, you've got the space race, this incredibly inspiring push to conquer the stars, leading to the moon landing and just massive leaps in technology. But running right in parallel to that, you have the absolutely terrifying nuclear arms race. Think about it. For every rocket designed to carry a human into space, another was being designed to carry a nuclear warhead right into a city. It's just a striking contrast, isn't it? Human ambition at its absolute best, right alongside our capacity for self-destruction at its absolute worst.
Now for part 4, the brink of annihilation.
You really can't build thousands of world-ending weapons without eventually hovering your finger right over the launch button. And in 1962, the entire world essentially held its breath. I'm talking, of course, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. discovers Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, literally just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. For 13 absolutely unbearable days, President Kennedy and his advisors ordered a naval blockade. And as the Soviet ships approached that line, the world stood on the literal precipice of total civilization-ending nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy actually summed up the sheer terror of this reality perfectly. He said, "It is insane that two men sitting on opposite sides of the world should be able to decide to bring an end to civilization." Just let that sink in for a second. Thousands of years of human history, art, science, all of it, nearly wiped out in an afternoon over a political standoff. It really shows just how terrifyingly close we came to seeing Hiroshima-level devastation on a global scale. Thankfully, the sheer terror of that crisis shocked both sides into finally backing away from the edge. This led to a period known as détente. Championed by leaders like Richard Nixon, this was basically a temporary thawing out of the Cold War. The two sides started signing arms control agreements, they opened up trade, and they even installed a direct red telephone line between Washington and Moscow, just to prevent any future miscalculations. Honestly, it was a much-needed deep breath for the entire world.
And this brilliantly illustrates part 5, the Soviet collapse.
But no standoff can last forever. Eventually, the immense pressure of this massive global chess match just had to break something. In the 1980s, détente officially ends. U.S. President Ronald Reagan aggressively ramps up military spending, essentially challenging the Soviet Union to try and keep up. Then, in a pretty desperate bid to save a stagnating economy, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduces these sweeping reforms. But instead of saving the system, these reforms act like a hammer hitting a cracked windshield. Everything shatters. By 1989, the ultimate symbol of the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, is literally being torn down by the very citizens it was meant to divide. The deadlock was finally broken. And then, in 1991, we get the official checkmate. The Soviet Union formally dissolves. This massive communist empire just fractures into independent republics, leaving the United States as the sole global superpower. That insane 45-year struggle, the shadow wars, the relentless nuclear anxiety, the massive ideological divide, it all officially comes to a close. Or did it? As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Did the Cold War ever truly end, or did it just change its name? When you look at modern geopolitics today, cyber warfare, new arms races, and constantly shifting spheres of influence, you really have to wonder, is the global chess match actually over, or have we just reset the board with new players? Keep questioning, keep learning, and as always, thank you so much for watching.
Imagine waking up tomorrow, flipping on the news, and finding out that one of the two most powerful empires on the planet, a nuclear superpower stretching across 11 time zones, just evaporated. Poof! No world-ending war, no alien invasion, literally just gone.
It's the ultimate historical mystery, right? How does a superpower just vanish overnight when literally nobody predicted it? Decades of Western intelligence, top-tier analysts, countless spies, and everyone missed it. We're talking about a gargantuan regime built on the immense power established since Stalin's Great Purge. Massive armies, space programs, and enough nukes to end the world a few times over. For nearly half a century, the globe was locked in the icy grip of the Cold War.
Everyone assumed the USSR was this permanent, unbreakable monolith. So, how does an unbreakable machine shatter in the blink of an eye?
Section 1. Root cause. Insane Soviet economics.
Okay, to understand how this massive empire fell apart, we have to look past the military parades and the nukes and look directly at the bank accounts. On one side, in the West, you had dynamic, consumer-driven wealth creation. If people wanted jeans, companies made jeans. But over in the Soviet Union, you had a stagnant financial system that was rotting from the inside out. It was plagued by centrally planned scarcity and just catastrophic resource mismanagement. While the West was booming with tech and wealth, Soviet citizens were literally waiting in hours-long lines just to buy basic, everyday necessities like bread or toilet paper.
Think of their central planning like a massive, high-stakes game of Monopoly. But it's a rigged game. There's no free market at all. Instead, one single player, the state, controls the bank, sets the price for every single property, dictates exactly what you're allowed to build, and completely ignores what the players actually need. When you have one single bureaucracy trying to calculate the price and production quotas for millions of individual goods across an entire continent, the math just guarantees a total disaster.
Basically, Soviet-style economics was insane. And this wasn't just some minor inefficiency or a bureaucratic hiccup either. This was a catastrophic structural failure. It kept Russia and the surrounding republics from becoming truly rich. It completely stifled innovation and drained their wealth to prop up this bloated military that swallowed a massive chunk of their GDP. They were bleeding out economically, and it was all entirely masked by heavy propaganda.
Section 2. The domino effect. Once that economic pressure cooker finally exploded, the timeline moved incredibly fast. We go from decades of frozen geopolitical deadlock to absolute chaos in just 3 years. In 1989, the Iron Curtain starts to crack as Poland and Hungary demand change. Then, November 1989, the unthinkable happens in Berlin. Fast forward to August 1991, the Soviet government turns on itself in a desperate coup, and by December, the empire is officially dead. Decades of history unraveling in a blink.
November 1989. This is the ultimate point of no return. The Berlin Wall, the literal and symbolic dividing line of the entire Cold War, crumbles. The scenes on the ground were euphoric, chaotic, and completely unfiltered. You had East and West Berliners weeping, embracing, and literally taking sledgehammers to the concrete that had divided their families for decades. And once Moscow refused to send in the tanks to stop it, well, every other Soviet satellite state realized the cage was finally unlocked. Section 3. Human barricades and tanks. Now, the old guard wasn't going to go down without a fight. This is where history actually feels like a movie. With the empire slipping away, hardliners inside the Soviet Communist Party launched a desperate last-ditch coup to seize back control in August 1991. The military rolls tanks right into the streets of Moscow. But instead of hiding, the citizens react in a way the hardliners never saw coming. They form massive human barricades. Everyday people, students, grandmothers, workers, literally putting their bodies on the line to block the military's advance. They had tasted a bit of freedom, and they flat out refused to let that iron grip close around them again.
And right in the middle of this intense standoff, we get one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Republic, walks right out of the parliament building, climbs directly onto one of the military tanks sent to suppress him, and delivers this defiant, booming speech. He rallies the military to stand down and side with the people. And it works. It shatters the coup entirely. The hardliners had the weapons for sure, but they've completely lost the people.
Section 4. The final nail. Gorbachev's farewell. The failure of that coup was the fatal blow. The fear was gone, and without fear, the Soviet Union had absolutely nothing left holding it together. So, on December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sits down in front of the cameras to deliver his farewell address. He resigns as president of a country that, practically speaking, no longer exists. With the stroke of a pen and one heavy historical address, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved into 15 independent states. The red flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the very last time, peacefully bringing the Cold War to an end.
It leaves us with a fascinating and honestly maybe slightly terrifying realization. We look at the superpowers of today, the massive institutions, the economies, the militaries, and we tend to assume they're permanent fixtures of human history. But as this explainer shows us, they aren't. They're fragile. They're built on systems, economies, and the collective belief of their citizens. And when those systems rot and that belief vanishes, even the biggest giants can fall in the blink of an eye. So what truly holds our modern world together today? Think about that and keep questioning the history that surrounds us.